All right, so next we have Rachel Lovell. Rachel Lovell is an applied criminologist and methodologist whose research focuses on gender-based violence and victimization, particularly sexual assault, human trafficking, and intimate partner violence. Since 2015, Dr. Lovell has led several large action research projects on untested sexual assault kits in collaboration with the Cuyahoga County Prosecutor's Office. So Rachel, whenever you're ready, you can go ahead and share your screen. We are excited to hear from you. Sure, great.
Good morning, everyone. Sorry, I am not able to be there in person, but I am teaching a class, actually a victimology course, in a few hours in Cleveland, so I wasn't able to attend in person, but I'm very excited about being able to present some of this information and work and be asked to present on some of this information, because I think it's a really important topic when we're talking about sexual violence. So the two goals that I have today for the presentation are, one, talk about the data on sexual violence so you have a better understanding of normalizing how common sexual assault is, as well as contextualizing under what context, and how to find information on sexual violence perpetration. The second goal I have today is to talk about what the research says on victim blaming and how the media or how descriptions of sexual violence can be construed within the population, talking about several psychological principles in this space. So with that, I will just also reiterate what the other Rachel said about needing a moment. There will be some narratives in here of talking about sexual violence. Oh, and since I already got introduced, yeah, I'm the a director of the Criminology Research Center and assistant professor of criminology at Cleveland State. The first section I want to talk about is really talking about data. So please don't get bored yet. I know it's just the first thing in the morning, so I'm glad the conversation on data came first. So stay with me a little bit as I kind of don't make you fall asleep, or hopefully you've had your coffee. And so I always present this image just to talk to students about victimization and violence, and that most of what we know about violence and victimization, and especially for sexual violence and victimization, is the stuff you see above the water of an iceberg. And there's so much more there's so much more to sexual victimization and sort of reporting rates than what we see above the water here. So there's really two ways that we know about sexual violence. One is what is reported to police, and one is what is reported on a survey. We're asking people about their victimization. The two very large, most well-used data on sexual, in particular for sexual victimization, that's reported to police are two main things. One is the Uniform Crime Report, which is handled by the FBI, and it's all the different police departments and law enforcement agencies reporting yearly reports to the FBI. It's been around since the 1920s. And it only really captures, it has some limitations. Primarily, it's crimes that have been investigated, and it is really only 8 major crimes, they're called index crimes, are reported in the UCR. NIBRS, which is the National Incident-Based Reporting System, was created more recently. It's also administered by the FBI, but it has information around incidents. So not crimes that have been investigated, but crimes that at the time of the incident report, hence the I in NIBRS. And then also it covers a lot more crime categories than the UCR does. So those are two ways of knowing about sexual violence that's reported to police. The other way that we really capture information or know information about sexual violence is through surveys, asking individuals. The two main ones that we have in that space, one is administered by the census, which is the National Crime Victimization Survey. And that one has, it's households randomized, representative of the population, as well as the National Intimate Partner and Sexual Violence Survey, which is administered by the CDC. And that one is specifically on intimate partner violence and sexual violence, whereas National Crime Victimization Survey has many different kinds of victimization categories, sexual violence being one of them. Okay. So in talking about what we mean then but those are all national ones. If we're talking about Ohio, you can find, I'm moving that out of the way. You can find two ways of looking at this that's specifically within Cleveland or within the state of Ohio. One, the Uniform Crime Report does break it out by police department. And so you can get very granular data on that, but for UCR it only reports rape. There isn't other categories of sexual violence other than rape, so that's all UCR has. NIBRS has more variations for that, and the Ohio Criminal Justice Services Agency, which is this sort of Ohio criminal justice database and services that are provided in that, although they're just reporting, if you go to OCJS, they're just reporting stuff on the UCR and NIBRS. So you could get that information yourself. If you're reporting on a survey, NCVS doesn't have, the National Crime Victimization Survey doesn't have something on Ohio, but the National Intimate Partner and Sexual Violence Survey does have a state report that's publicly available. And they have a more recent survey coming out. And I read online when I was doing this that their state report is coming out fairly soon. So they should have updated data on that as well. So these are the best ways and places to get information on sexual victimization that's going to give you good estimates of prevalence, as well as types and definitions of other sorts of things. So since I'm doing this remotely, I figured you didn't want to hear a very long lecture, me just talking about these sorts of things. So I thought I would incorporate some of the things that I use in my class on this. So one is Mentimeter. So if the people in the audience or on Zoom want to go to menti.com and use this code at the top, just type in this 6184483 code at the top, you should be able to get to this survey here and be able to answer these questions as a sort of learning module about crimes and how we know about different crimes. So let's see. So I'm on full screen. Taylor, okay, good. Okay, there's the first one coming through. So if you, so again, go to menti.com on your phone or laptop, anything with an internet access, and then type in that code. You should be able to see responses in real time. Yeah, perfect. Thank you. Okay. Okay. Yes, so the UCR is the one reported to police there, as well as, which is not an option on here, but NIBRS is also something that's reported to police. The National Crime Victimization Survey also includes information that's reported to police and not reported to police, but the UCR is the only one that has something reported specifically to police. That is very important when you're looking at sexual victimization, since rape is the most underreported violent crime in the United States, as well as other countries as well. So it's very important to distinguish between reported rapes as well as overall rapes and overall victimization. So the answer is the UCR. You all are paying attention. Okay, what about a database that was created to address the flaws in the Uniform Crime Reports? Yes, it's NIBRS, the National Incident-Based Reporting System. Perfect. Okay. Yes, neighbors. Okay. Now I want to move on to a little bit of, so I told you where to find the data and sort of some of the main distinctions of the different parts of the data, whether it's reported or not. But the other thing I think is very important, in particular when you're reporting or talking about sexual victimization, is that we use terms that are well defined in terms of what that means. The reason for this is because the social definition of rape is not necessarily the legal definition of rape or the state statute for rape. So what we sort of think of and categorize as rape is not what necessarily what surveys or police reports or other sorts of things distinguish as rape. So here's one big example, the UCR prior to 2012. So that's an exclamation point, defined rape as the carnal knowledge of a female forcibly and against her will. The definition was changed in 2012 to the definition that you see on the right. The difference here, and you'll see it when you look up data on the UCR on the FBI's website, is that they'll have like what they call the legacy definition and then the current definition of rape. And so if you're looking at the legacy definition, know that reported rapes, then you'll see a change in the rates over time, especially around this time. And it's because they included males as being raped, because prior to 2012, the UCR did not define a male being raped as rape. It had to be forcibly, and it had to be primarily vaginal penetration, which is what the sort of old-timey word for carnal knowledge is. And so we now define it as something much broader, as without the consent, penetration of any oral, anal, or vaginal penetration by an object or a sexual organ. So a much broader definition. So if you're looking at these or trying to make sure that you're understanding, here's a great example of why defining something, or when you're looking at the stats, is very important, or looking at the definition of that. So so before we move on to sort of incident rates, I thought maybe I could pull what you think are the percentage of the prevalence rates in the United States. What percentage of women experience attempted or completed rape during their lifetime? Okay. Oh, I didn't put the answer on here. So unfortunately, I have a typo in my slide here. 1 in 3 is not correct. It is not correct, but only because it should be 1 in 5. But of the options that you had, 1 in I didn't even catch that. It should be 1 in 5 women experience an attempted or completed rape in her lifetime. But the only option you have there is closest is 1 in 3. What about what percentage of men were made to penetrate somebody else, attempted or complete? Notice here, not being penetrated, but made to penetrate somebody else. Yeah. It is, the answer is 1 in 36. Or I'm sorry, it's 1 in 14. 1 in 36 is the rates for men who have been penetrated against their will, so have been raped, and then 1 in 14 men have been forced to penetrate somebody else. Here, again, the distinction between defining what we mean by rape, made to penetrate versus being penetrated, is an important distinction in describing and understanding the data. The other important thing is, for example, the NISVS, the National Intimate Partners in Sexual Violence Survey that the CDC does, has very detailed information about exactly how they define sexual violence and various aspects of sexual violence. They break it out by contact and non-contact, and then they have distinctions for rape, being made to penetrate, which are almost all men who experience that, sexual coercion, and then unwanted sexual contact, and then various other types of non-contact. And then, and when you're talking about, though, if you're writing, for example, about a crime, if you're using the state statutes, there's very much more complicated definitions of what these mean. So sexual battery and rape both involve penetration, but they have different levels here, for example, in Ohio. So noticing the difference between what a survey might define as rape, what a suspect might be charged with, is something very different. So again, just being able to be as detailed as you can or explicit as you can, because what the public kind of thinks about is this overall general idea of rape, which could include being made to penetrate. It could be unwanted sexual contact or sexual coercion or rape. So being able to distinguish between those things. Here for the Ohio Revised Code, I put the 4 felony sex crimes, but there's others there. I have all the links that I have in my presentation. I've hyperlinked and have provided the slides to Ohio Alliance, so they can, or happy to share some of this information so you can go to the actual links themselves. So we talked about the national rates, but I want to also distinguish between what happens nationally and even at the state level, and then go down even further into when you're talking about rates of sexual victimization, is to look at it. It varies quite a bit by the city. So Cleveland has the highest violent crime rate in the state of Ohio, and very high rates of violent crime nationally as well. So for example, the national average rate of rape is 42.6 rapes per 100,000, according to the UCR and NIBRS, or actually UCR and NIBRS would have the same there. But the Cleveland rate is 120 rapes in 2018, which is 3 times the national average. Additionally, since NIBRS shows that of reported rapes, about 90% of the victims are female, again, of those that are reported. And so that's about 1 in every 1,500 females. If you look at Cleveland's female rape rate, you have, again, 1 in 500 women, which is about 3 times the national average. So just because you're looking at national statistics or even statewide doesn't mean that you'll see that same picture regionally, like within a city. To further emphasize that you have to get granular sometimes when you're talking about this, this is a map of Cleveland from a recent publication that we had, my team and I had, on the rape kit data that was talked about earlier. So these are ones where someone reported, had a sexual assault kit collected, and was recently only tested as part of this sexual assault kit initiative in Cuyahoga County. We defined in a very specific way about rapes where victims were walking or waiting when they were sexually assaulted. So what was the victim doing whenever she was approached by a stranger and she didn't consensually leave the scene? So that's our definition of walking and waiting. And we found, even if you break it down into certain areas, this is the Cleveland with deprivation deciles sort of mapped onto that as a way to measure poverty. And you can see that there's 7 hotspots in those areas. Downtown area is the big area right here, as well as the flats, which are right here. So this is sort of the downtown flats area. Flats is more of like a bar entertainment / area that used to be more entertainment area and has some strip clubs as well as bars, music venues, other sorts of things. Downtown, of course, is a transportation hub. The rest of these are all neighborhoods in Cleveland, which are primarily comprised of African-American women of residents. And so here's Central, Kingsman, Buckhout, Woodhill area. Here's the Glenview area. And then there's the near west side, These are really micro areas. And so when we're also talking about certain types of victimization, or you're trying to report on certain aspects, really breaking it down by these micro areas or neighborhoods, because we know crime is heavily influenced by the environment and by neighborhoods. So just looking at it at the state or national level doesn't give us a good glimpse, because this paper shows that, for example, Black women are significantly more likely than white women to be sexually assaulted while walking or waiting, because they are the residents in these communities and they are less likely to have a vehicle and therefore are more exposed to the environment. I was going to show a video, but for time, we're not going to, but there is a hyperlink here to talking about sexual trauma and victim blaming and the trauma response. It's a very good video. It's 8 minutes. I show it to my students. So again, if you want the presentation, Ohio Lines can send it to you and you can click on the hyperlink to that video. But just to tell some brief points on this, I will say I'm not the expert on the neurobiology of trauma or trauma response. My training is as a victimologist and sociologist, not a psychologist, but I have linked here some really great work by some amazing scholars who are really experts in this field. However, I can summarize some of these points. I tell you these points in the context of storytelling. So if you're telling a story about a sexual violence that occurred to somebody, there's certain things that you might have noticed about the way that someone would recall telling the story. So certain memories that they are encoded differently in a traumatic situation, which are often tied to your senses. So, touch, taste, smell, those sorts of things. And those are the things, those are what is considered more your reptilian brain. These are the things that are going to keep you alive. So you go in sort of a fight or flight or freeze mode. You go into this like high risk situation, this life or death survival situation, and a trauma response. And so the things that you need to remember most, like touch, taste, smell, are the things that you're going to remember most. So I remember one survivor telling me that, she couldn't remember the perpetrator's face at all, but she could tell you everything about the gun that was pointed at her while he raped her. So that's what she focused on, was the barrel of that gun, because that was the thing that was most immediate to her. So telling the story that she couldn't remember the face might come off as victim blaming. Saying that she could remember every aspect of the gun that was pointed at her tells a different type of storytelling. There's other parts that might not be encoded as part of that. So again, she may not remember his face. One of the famous ones was Dr. Blasey Ford during the Kavanaugh hearings. Everyone was made a lot about how she couldn't remember how she got home that night, which was perceived as being lying. But in a trauma situation, remembering how you got home wasn't what kept you alive. It was what was happening in that situation. And so some parts just your brain didn't need to remember, because that wasn't the most important part during a high trauma stress situation. Sometimes victims' reactions can be construed as irrational. So I can tell you, I was once in a very serious car accident when I was 17 years old. And I actually had a cell phone with me, but instead of calling 911, I called my mother. And so I just called her and said, I'm hurt really bad. And she was like, did you call 911? I was like, no. So in that trauma situation, I wasn't thinking, about calling for help from 911. I was just thinking, I need my mom, sort of thing. So sometimes that may seem as irrational and not really helping the situation. Victims often wonder, and people often ask them, why didn't you do this? Why didn't you do that? And oftentimes it has to do, while we talk about fight or flight, freeze is the most common, and especially in sexual violence. An extreme form of that is called tonic immobility, where you literally are immobile. You can't move. You're like in a catatonic state, which is a very common response in that. So people, why didn't you run? Why didn't you scream for help? And it's because their body froze, because that's actually one of the best survival techniques that all animals have. including us, but also victims, and we see this in police reports. Police are confused by victims' responses to laughing or to having no affect or to sometimes crying, which they expect, but they don't expect sort of laughing or no affect. So these are also common parts of that. And I tell you, and then the last one is really, sometimes victims are not able to tell a narrative of an event in a linear progression, because a trauma situation the memories aren't encoded in a linear way, because it's not like, well, this morning I got dressed and then went down and got coffee and then I did this and then I did that. That's what police want in narratives, and that's what reporters want as part of that, because they're setting that this is a dark and stormy night kind of event, and they want that sort of narrative story, but victims may not be able to tell it in a linear progression. They tell it in oftentimes in a kind of sporadic sort of way. The information is still there. It's just not this narrative that's nice and clean in terms of a linear effect. So you've seen some reports where a victim is telling this whole event of while she was raped, and then something like, oh, and then the second guy did this, and you're like, well, where'd the second guy come from? Like, how was he there? What was happening there? It seems as being lying, but it's not. It's whenever her memories or his memories encoded that as being the most important part of when that second person started to do something. She, and she may not be able to tell all the things that are kind of coming up as long as part of that. Sometimes this is described as sort of being your cold and warm brain, but I really try to encourage or tell people to really think about things like car accidents and other trauma situations where they remember being and acting in some ways like this. Like, for example, me, sort of calling my mom instead of calling 911. So within an oppression framework, if we're talking about reporting, and we've talked about how victims might be able to remember or not remember certain events or in certain sorts of ways, how can media's reporting make victim blaming worse? So here's a quote from a recent book that my colleague and I have coming out next month, from the introduction. And I think it really adequately summarizes succinctly who's most at risk. So we know that rape is a crime that primarily affects women and girls, the most vulnerable among us and or the marginalized. So that includes children and adolescents, boys and girls, women and girls of color, LGBTQ individuals, those of limited economic means, those with disabilities, those with substance abuse issues, those the influence of drugs and alcohol, and especially those at the intersections of these things, and or those that hold multiple marginalized identities. So we're not talking about, it's not random, and people are not at an equal probability of having this. So really looking at this, but framing it in terms of oppression and vulnerabilities helps us better understand sexual victimization. So, I put it into Mentimeter, and now this is a GIF that's not gonna show you. So reporters often talk about doing things with very human-centered stories, right? And as Rachel DeSalle talked about earlier, wanting to really tell it from the victim's perspective, I think is important. If this GIF was working, it would show, here's woman raped at man's flat after 12 glasses of wine. When it finishes, it says, man raped woman at her flat, right? So while reporters certainly, want to tell that story from a victim's perspective and work around that, what we actually find is that sometimes that can be detrimental. Instead, you're telling it from the victim's perspective, but in many cases can set up a woman to be victim blamed for her actions and her behaviors. So why not tell it from the perspective of the suspect and the suspect's actions in exploiting that vulnerability, as compared to what led a woman to being victimized? I also want to pause and say that I have been using very gendered terms for this. One has to do with the fact that women are more likely to be raped than men. And individuals who are transgender are at higher risk, however, much higher risk. However, there's very little good data on transgender sexual victimization, especially in national estimates, because police reports don't really keep good data or have good information on who is transgender or not cisgender. So while I'm using these very gendered ways of talking about victims and suspects, it doesn't mean that there's not variation in this. So I just want to be clear about the use of pronouns there. I'm talking about it from this very like modal perspective on this. So what is victim blaming? I thought this was a very good definition of victim blaming, although there's many different ways of looking at this. But basically you're saying that the victim is wholly or partially responsible for what happened to them. The field of victimology itself, and as a victimologist, I can sort of talk about this, came from a very victim blaming way of looking at crime. So it was actually a study of, and early victimology was about seeing the culpability that victims had in their own victimization. The field has greatly advanced since the 1960s and 50s when the field started to really take off, but in particular for sexual violence, this becomes a persistent problem. I wanted to frame this first by talking about, I know that there was an op-ed that came out last year from Cleveland.com, and they were saying that from now on, they're going to admit from their stories whether a victim was intoxicated. And it was inspired by a rape survivor who wrote in to the editor saying, hey, you know, why did you write in that I was highly intoxicated when I was kidnapped and from downtown while I was waiting for an Uber? So framing it in terms, she took issue with the fact that why she was described in that way when it was the actual perpetrator who was the one who committed the crime and kidnapped her and did all these sorts of things. So sort of setting it up as if it was her fault that she was sexually assaulted. The Cleveland.com said, okay, well, now on, we're not going to be adding in that information about that. P.S. This man was also accused of doing this to other women as well. Here's another example, and this is actually from one of the rape kit ones, a brief summary of a rape from the rape kids. Here, the victim, a woman, was drinking with her sister and this man named Leon, who stays at the hotel with this man named Leon and an unknown male. She decided she was ready to go home. He offered her a ride. She accepted. Instead, he drove her to a different location, ordered her to take off her clothes. He threatened to shoot her. And so the thing that she remembers, again, that touch, taste, smell, senses, is that there were trains. She remembers hearing trains, but she didn't remember where she was. And he forced fellatio and vaginal intercourse. Okay. Here is another story or another narrative from the police reports, a summary of the narratives of something that happened. One is that she was walking home at 3 a.m. It began to rain. He pulled up in the perpetrator pulled up in a beige vehicle and offered her a ride, which she accepted. He took her to a different location. He locked the windows. He pulled behind an abandoned house, produced a gun and a knife, and again forced fellatio and vaginal intercourse. If in writing a story, a reporter might start off with the details about walking home at 3 a.m., taking a ride from somebody she didn't know, those are very much in the realm of victim blaming, as well as what was she doing at 3 a.m.? Oh, she must have been a prostitute. Now, the reporter may not be writing that, but those details may lead the reader to see that as being that she has some culpability in what happened to her. And that if she hadn't taken a ride, if she hadn't been by herself, if she hadn't been walking alone at night, then these things wouldn't have happened to her. I can tell you that these two rapes actually were one of 7 committed by the same male who was, the rapes were tied together through DNA. So again, if you're, instead of taking it from its seen in isolation and focused on the victim's behaviors and actions prior to the sexual violence, instead, if you focus on the perpetrator here, what was he doing? That he's one of 7, that this was actually a fairly typical MO that he did, which was exploiting the vulnerabilities of women to sexually assault them. So again, shifting the narrative, which I think the natural inclination for reporters and for journalists is to write it from a victim's perspective, but instead focusing on the actions of the perpetrator might actually reduce victim blaming. We've traditionally viewed it as, you know, within this rape myth acceptance framework, where we talk about real rapes and who can be raped and who's to blame in those rapes. But really interesting research that's coming out with police says traditionally police have kind of been asked these questions around rape myth acceptance, such as victim blaming for being promiscuous, having bad reputations, secretly desiring to be raped, not expressing a firm no. These are traditional questions in rape myth acceptance scales. But more recent research, in particular with police, is showing that it's not so much that they adhere to rape myth acceptance, but instead see victims' culpability, like she should have known better not to take a ride or not to be alone at 3 a.m. And in terms of righteous victims, so they have to kind of prove that they want an investigation and are worthy of that, of their effort. But while we talk about this with police, what we also find, and there's some really interesting research, not mine, other people did, is sometimes by focusing on this, that actually readers and the public are also blaming victims in this, as well as reporters, maybe even with their best intentions, are meaning not to do this, but they are doing this. So telling it from the victim's experience in the story, even in a sympathetic way, might increase the likelihood of victim blaming. Why? There's 2 main psychological principles here. One is a hindsight bias, which is sort of psychological principle that we sort of knew it all along, which is a tendency to look back at events that we could not have possibly predicted and think that the outcome was predictable. Like, oh, I knew the Browns were going to lose yesterday. Well, the Browns did lose yesterday, but you didn't know that and you couldn't have predicted it necessarily. But after the fact, you kind of look back and go, well, of course they did, because I knew all along. So what happens is in our brain is that we selectively remember information that confirms what we already know. We already know the outcome, and then we selectively remember information that already confirms that. And that readers then interpret victims' behaviors, assuming that they already knew the outcome. So they're looking at, well, what did, you go home with someone you're walking at 3 a.m., you take a ride from someone, victims should have known that this would have been the outcome. But that's not what victims experience, because they don't know the outcome at the beginning. And that in retrospect, it's often easy to see danger coming, as if you're watching a sort of terrible horror story where it's like, no, don't go in that house. No, don't talk to that stranger. But that's not what happens in real life when you don't know the outcome. And part of that is because it's comforting for people to think about the world as being orderly and predictable, when in fact it's not. The second principle here is the just world hypothesis, also a psychological principle, which in particular in the US is highly enforced, which is that bad is punished and good is rewarded. So that really it's a bias that shows that people deserve what happens to them, and that actions are morally fair and have sort of fitting consequences. In other words, the world is fair, we control our destinies. But that also is a way to also avoid thinking about things that you hope don't happen to you. It also leads to victims blaming themselves. So this happened to me, so I must have deserved it in some sort of way. It's also a failure to empathize with victims. There's sort of not wanting to put yourself in their situations to see their behavior, because you don't want to think about that thing happening to you. Even in the prevention world and with those working in the prevention world, working around this idea that you can prevent rape if only A, B, and C happens, can also lead to this sort of just world hypothesis and victim blaming, where it's like, if we just work to prevent it here, then if it's not prevented, then it's somehow the victim's fault. So here's two really, I think, succinct ways of looking at this. In particular for women, victim blaming is a self-preservation tactic where we distance ourselves from the victims by saying that would never happen to us because I would never make the decisions that the victim did. So here's this really great, great in a bad way, Facebook comment where it's like, who puts a bed beside a window on the first floor and then sleeps with the window open? And then someone says, yeah, that's what I was thinking. Like, I would never put my bed beside a window on a first floor. So I would never have somebody sneak into my window and rape me in the middle of the night. So there's that sort of social distancing happening there. But what we really talk about, here's a story of a woman in Australia who was raped and while she was walking home at night. And there was this very big movement that happened around this because police just put out this sort of blurb saying, women need to take responsibility for walking alone, making sure you know where you are and you carry a mobile phone if you have to walk. Although she was actually texting when she was about to come home saying that she was safe to her partner. So even in this case, she did have a phone, but even if she didn't, the advice given in particular to women to avoid being assaulted, in particular by strangers, but all means that we can't possibly avoid all the things that could possibly go wrong because, you know, it's like, don't go outside, but actually you're more likely to be killed by someone you know in your home than you are outside. You're more likely to be raped by an intimate partner than you are by a stranger. And so there's any number of things that women can and can't do around this. So it's really like, don't exist in the world because you can't possibly cover all the things that a woman would need to do to avoid being victimized in multiple ways. So there's two ways that the articles here cited talk about ways to reduce victim blaming. And in the article, the psychologist, what they did was they changed through experiments the ways that the perpetrator was talked about by really putting the perpetrator as the subject of the sentence, not the victim. So even getting down to the minutia of how you write. When the perpetrator was the subject of the sentence, the rating for victim blaming went down, and they were less likely to blame a victim's behavior in general. So like Dan approached Lisa as compared to Lisa approached Dan. So getting definitely in the minutia there. There's also a way that people talk about rapists as being sort of monsters, the mentally ill, sickos, not normal people. Whenever we know that, in fact, about 30% of college-age men have perpetrated some form of sexual violence by the time they, you know, in college or prior to college. So by the time they reach college, about a third of men have perpetrated, college men have perpetrated some form of sexual violence. So in fact, it's not just the sickos, it's not just the monsters. Well, they may be that. What actually ends up happening when you describe it as sort of a Netflix documentary sort of thing is that then when confronted with knowing a perpetrator, you couldn't, then they think, oh, that couldn't possibly be my son, my friend, my colleague, my friend, those sorts of things. And we saw that a lot within Me Too, as terms of, oh, he's a good guy, he couldn't have possibly done that. But when you describe that sort of mythology of a rapist, you're doing a disservice to victims as well. Instead, I would argue the way to avoid victim blaming, and in particular for those that are more marginalized and vulnerable, is to talk about it in terms of the suspect as the subject, their actions, and how they exploited vulnerabilities as compared to what the victim did leading up to that. So we've written or presented on stuff where we've defined vulnerabilities in these three ways. One would be in situ, which is an archaeological term that means on site or in position. Here, meaning a very momentary vulnerability that the perpetrator exploits, like being alone at night, walking and waiting, being in the process of running away. They interceded somehow in a momentary vulnerability. There's also long-term vulnerability, that characteristics like being institutionalized, being an active drug user, a current sex worker, mentally and cognitively impaired, being unhoused. Those long-term vulnerabilities leave someone vulnerable to being sexually violated, and often multiple times and by multiple individuals. And then there's the criminal justice vulnerability, which is looking at it from someone's diminished ability to be a credible witness. So sometimes victims can't remember, and prosecutors are less willing to take those cases because if a victim was drugged and or intoxicated and they can't remember exact the things that happened to them, prosecutors are often reluctant to take those cases. And jurors may not believe them if they're not seen as being credible. So some examples of this are those that are sort of a history of prostitution or drug use, or a history of being a runaway, being currently intoxicated, those types of things, which are also exploited by perpetrators because they think they can get away with perpetrating against someone who is intoxicated or somehow won't be believed. And sadly, in many cases, victims aren't believed when these things happen to them. The last sort of thing that I'll be talking about is working within working with researchers, and I've worked with Rachel DeSalle as well as others on various projects. So I'm just going to tout why I think reporters and journalists and others should be working in concert with researchers on this. So in the victimology field, for example, some of the things that we talked about, the Cleveland.com is saying, okay, they won't give the detail that she was intoxicated. But maybe it's just more than just don't talk about, we won't mention that she was intoxicated. Maybe it's not setting that it was a dark and stormy night narrative where you describe from her perspective or from the victim's perspective all the things that led up to that initial part, and sort of setting the scene for that. Setting the scene can lead to victim blaming because, again, it's from the victim's perspective. And if you talk about it from here, victims' actions being intoxicated or walking alone at 3 a.m., there's any number of things that a victim could be blamed for if you're talking about it in terms of her actions. Why did she get so intoxicated? Why did she take an Uber? Why did she mistake the person for being the one that she thought was an Uber, but instead was her rapist? Why didn't she do this? Why didn't he do that? There's any number of ways that you could sort of lead that up to there. And then lastly, I would say here in working this, you can really start to see, again, looking at it from a perpetrator's perspective and how they exploited that vulnerability. So I think it's not just enough not to talk about, oh, we won't mention if a victim isn't not intoxicated or is intoxicated or not intoxicated. Instead, it's really focusing on the perpetrator's actions and how they exploited the victim's vulnerabilities in those instances. And by working, for example, in the field of victimology, we can provide important context into their stories by why was it there? Who was doing all this and why were their actions there? How often are these things happening? Where are they happening? For example, the maps. What are the consequences for victims? What happens when the victim blaming becomes internalized? But also we think a lot about what's next, how to improve society, what can we do? And we work to help make these, our research and the findings applicable to policies and practices. So we think a lot about what the next step is and how to improve things. So by working with reporters, working with researchers, I think reporters can get a lot better context to their stories because it provides this overall context that's not just the lead up of the dark and stormy night, but how can we frame this in a better way? That's the conclusion of this. I will say, here's my email address and my Twitter handle. I think it's called handle. Am I getting too old? I think so. I think it's a handle. And here is the citations, which again, I'm not expecting you to write down, but I can give this out. So like any good researcher, I cite my sources. And then actually can open it up to the audience since I'm doing Zoom and I couldn't see anyone or can't see the audience. Here using that same menti.com, if you use this code, the question should pop up on here and I can see it from everyone instead of having to have somebody answer, ask the questions from someone in the room.
That sounds great. I can also turn the camera just so you can
Okay.
see the audience.
Perfect.
You're answering. Does that show most of the room?
Yes. Yep.
Okay, great. If anyone has any questions, you can go back to that Mentimeter and use the code to type your question. Thank you so much, Rachel.
Yes, absolutely. Thanks for having me.
I see some folks typing and stuff, so we'll just give it a little bit.
Sure. Oh, yeah, sure. Yes.
And we will share also
So it's okay. Yeah, it's r.e. My middle name is Elizabeth. Lovell at CSU .edu or CSUOhio.edu. If you just put CSU, I think you will get Colorado State, which is not where I am. And then yeah, R Lovell 100 for Twitter. Okay. Okay.
And we'll share the recording with registered attendees as well in the slides. Yeah.
If there are people who don't want to, my students want to engage on their phones. So even though I'm right in front of them, they like engaging through their phones. But if you actually want to ask a question just the old-fashioned way, I'm also more than happy to answer those.
Great.
Okay.
Are there any other questions from in-person?
I think there's coming up. Okay. You mentioned that the rate of rape in Cleveland is 3 times higher. Yes. Could that be because they are more frequently reported rather than just occurring? That it could be, yes. But then there would have to be a reason why Cleveland would report more than the state, than national, and other sorts of things. So it's certainly possible that they are reporting more, except for I haven't seen any evidence to suggest that women in Cleveland would be or women and men in Cleveland would be reporting more often than not. Like that they would sort of want to report more. I have published a study with Rachel DeSalle actually looking at how potentially a lot of her work that was published around the rape kit testing actually had an influence of whether victims were getting a sexual assault kit when they were reporting. So to say that media reporting doesn't have an impact, I think it's inaccurate to say that the media reporting wouldn't influence whether a victim wants to get a kit, and probably also report as well. So there may be some of that, but given how the violent rates of crime in Cleveland, I can also tell you that robberies are 3 times the national average. Homicide is higher than the national average. So it's likely more that it's just more common than it is more likely to report, but it's certainly possible. And the data wouldn't be able to tell you that whether it's more frequently reported or just more frequent. At least the UCR data wouldn't. What number do I see reporters get wrong? I think it's primarily conflating the different types of sexual violence. So talking about, I think, you know, if you're talking about, you know, there are different definitions for sort of rape, again, in the more general sense versus rape in the coercive sense. So like the National Intimate Partner Sexual Violence Survey distinguishes between forcible rape, or if you're incapacitated, then you couldn't prevent force, you know, so rape in that sense, versus being sexually coerced into having sex against your will are two different actual ways of looking at sexual violence. And I think sometimes conflating those and just talking about it from its more general sense can do disservice to the victim, to the audience, because you're conflating things, as well as because those are actually very different types of sexual violence. And so the responses might be different, the settings might be very different, the how the rape occurred might be different. So I think that's probably what I see the most often, is the incorrect way of sort of describing the sexual violence, as well as also not explaining why certain charges apply. So why a sexual battery as compared to a rape? Like, why were they charged with sexual battery and not rape? What's the difference between, you know, sexual imposition and sexual battery? So if someone was charged in that, taking the time and the space and the story to define why or what that charge means, I think is important. Okay. So assault on lifetime, I think the best survey for that is the National Intimate Partner Violence Survey. It's done by the CDC. They ask respondents in a random sample that's nationally representative and also representative at the state level. So they have a complex sampling technique to sample first at the state. And so it's state representative and nationally represented. And that's where they do ask the questions about what's reported, not reported, and has a lot of information, as well as the National Crime Victimization Survey. It doesn't just cover sexual violence, but it does break out reported and unreported numbers, and they give those stats out every year. So you can see trend lines, as well as looking at underreported numbers for that across a lifetime. One thing I always tell my students is that lifetime is a very important component in looking and distinguishing between the last 12 months versus lifetime. The reason being that women in particular are much greater risk of sexual violence over their whole lifespan. More importantly, really up until the time they have increased risk compared to men and boys up until they reach about 25 or 30 years old. They're at very high risk, even as children. Certainly adolescents and college age girls and women are at increased risk, whereas boys lifetime means primarily the prepubescent boys. And then if a man was incarcerated, institutionalized, a group home, has a disability or other sorts of things, then that's when they are at increased risk of forced penetration. But that's why looking at the difference between lifetime and last 12 months is sort of different, but important context of looking at the data. Oh, okay. I think I answered. Yeah, I think I answered that one. So I think those are the four. Yeah. Any other questions that you all had in the audience or other people on? Let's see. I think there's some questions in the chat. Does victim blaming occur when reporting other crimes? Great question. Yes, victim blaming occurs in reportings of almost all kinds of crimes. Again, getting at that hypothesis of a just world. However, sexual violence has much higher rates of victim blaming, and across the spectrum, if you look at if you look at victim culpability, victim blaming within the literature. Sexual violence is the type of crime that you will see most often victims blamed for it. But yes, it does occur across all reporting. So some of this information would also be applicable if you were reporting on other crimes such as burglary or robbery. And you see that a lot with, police bulletins of like, I see it all the time I live in a suburb of Cleveland, police remind, please lock your doors, that sort of thing. And so there is some of that, but the effect that it has on the victim is very different. So getting your car stolen and being blamed for it versus being raped and getting blamed for it are different things. But yes, that's a great question. It does occur across all crime types. How are we doing on time?
Yeah, we are great. You have at least 15 minutes left.
Okay.
And then we have a break. So if we needed more time for questions, we could do that too.
No, I think there might be. Let's see. Oh, okay. Yep. I think I answered them all. Okay. Yeah, I feel free to reach out to me if you're ever in need of data or stats. I love talking about data and stats, as well as I appreciate individuals' willingness to sort of work through some of these difficult topics and what does it mean to tell a story from a victim's perspective. And what does it mean also for jurors and for prosecutors and other sorts of things? You want to create space for sort of letting the victim's story be there. And as Rachel talked about earlier, like not wanting to have the victim necessarily direct the story, but telling it from the victim's perspective. And we do kind of go with general approaches, like we don't name victims, we don't do all these sorts of things, but I think there are ways that you could minimize that, because I know prosecutors, jurists often tell primarily the story from the victim's perspective, instead of focusing so much on the perpetrators. And they often make decisions about the worthiness of a case before even talking to a suspect. So they're sort of weighing, what did she say here? What does the victim say here? Does that seem credible? And then weighing that before deciding to move forward. And I think that kind of thing also misses the boat. If you focus more on the perpetrator and their actions, you'll get a much better sense of telling a true story, which is that they are most of the time very rational and making rational decisions, sometimes right in the moment, but making rational decisions about perpetration.
I did a question through Mentimeter and it didn't get an answer.
Oh,
Did not go through. I'm new to the Mentimeter, so.
Okay, sorry. Yeah, sorry. Yeah, go ahead, please.
One of the prompts you had given us was about forced to penetrate sexual assault, and that's not something I'm super familiar with. So can you give me some like examples or instances of where you've seen that in your reporting?
Yeah, that's a great question, and it is a more recent field within sexual violence about being forced to penetrate, and they started to ask specific questions around that. There are some really great researchers, primarily in the UK, but there are some here as well that are trying to do a better job of defining that and seeing that. The literature so far is showing that sometimes it's called forced to penetrate, sometimes it's called being made to penetrate. The modal category for that would be men who are, and the surveys will show, are disproportionately being made to penetrate women, and women are forcing them basically through coercion or through other means to penetrate them. So if you can think of, again, these are modal, not all the situations, but if you can sort of think, men report being intoxicated and women forcing them to have sex, forcing the victim is male. He is intoxicated. He is too intoxicated, but a woman is forcing him to penetrate her, or using it through coercion by saying, I will report you, I will take away your kid, won't let you see this, all these sorts of things through traditional coercion techniques that men often use as well on women through sexual coercion. So again, this is a unique category because this is the group where women have much higher rates. And I actually recently wrote a paper on this. So I'm happy to provide that as well in the chat. I'm one of many co-authors that sort of broke down some, and it's actually a response to another article that incorrectly interpreted the stats on this. So we have this whole thing that kind of breaks down this whole made to penetrate and the issues around that and male victimization. So I'm happy to provide that. But I think it's an important topic and one that is just recently being explored because they're just recently asking those questions about being made to penetrate. That's a great question. I see one in the chat. Do you have for journalists of being mindful of avoiding adultification? Yeah, young girls and non-binary folks. So we do know, and I work, I have several projects where we have nearly 6,000 rape reports. We have all the text for that. And we read a lot of rape reports. And one of the things that we see is that, and it's consistent in the literature, that in particular for Black girls, who are more likely to go through puberty earlier. So that's also, something that has been shown to be consistently that Black girls often go through puberty early, develop earlier, and the body types often tend to mean that they have more adult-looking bodies than non-Black women, and that they're sort of construed as having more control over some of those things. The way that it presents oftentimes in reports is, we've seen some of this, they mention a woman's bra size, a young girl's bra size, a 12 or 13-year-old girl. They describe them as runaways or some aspect of that, or unrulies. So they're describing the victim blaming in particular for Black cisgender girls in terms of adultification around, again, being runaways, unruly, describing their bodies. Now, there is a component to the statute, which is, would a reasonable person assume that this person was underage? So under certain contexts, it may be important to denote, for example, he says, let's say the perpetrator's a he, and he says in a criminal case, hey, I thought she was of age because she, if you sort of think, maybe you guys are too young, but if you think about that Will Smith song about parents just don't understand. Do you remember that? Does anyone remember that? I used to, sometimes all my students are like, I don't even know what you're talking about. I was born in 2000. You're like, whatever. So there's a song that he like steals his dad's Porsche, and he's driving it around, and he pulls up a girl, and she's a 12-year-old runaway, but he's like coming on to her, and she's coming on to him, and he's like, what, you're 12? Okay. So part of that legally is to sort of show, was there reason to assume that she wasn't old enough? And so part of a prosecutor's job is to show that that this person should have reasonably assumed that this girl was not of age. Sometimes they do that through perhaps mentioning, that she isn't very developed, or if she is developed, how young does she look, and other sorts of things. So they'll pull in pictures and other things. So when journalists also write about those sorts of things, I think being mindful of for some individuals, especially those that are economically marginalized, many of those younger girls, which are disproportionately women of color or girls of color, they are more likely to be have adult responsibilities, right? Caring for siblings, helping with the household chores and responsibilities, and other sorts of things that you'll see in more economically marginalized households. Being mindful of writing up those things in a way that doesn't try to make that person appear as if they're biologically, their bodies may be one thing, but their brains are not necessarily that of an adult making adult decisions. We also know that all teenagers' brains aren't fully developed until they're 25. And even if they were 25, they're still not responsible for what happened, to somebody's victimization of them. But so I think being mindful of sort of setting that scene also means not writing about the victims in a very adult sort of way, as if they are making decisions in this sort of linear way whenever they won't be doing it like that. Did I answer? I think I'm okay. Hang on, let me see. I thought there was maybe some more I didn't answer. Okay, there's your question now, being made to penetrate. Okay. Oh yeah. So I've written quite a bit about myths about serial perpetration and how the Sexual Assault Kit Initiative is giving us new information about just the extent of serial perpetration. I think we've traditionally thought of serial perpetrators as those that are like what was that guy's name from California who was like not the Menendez brothers, but the, we sort of want to think about them as this like cult of personality, or someone who, like, thanks to CSI and SVU and those other shows that like are super planned out, and they have all these, they break into women's homes and they have duct tape and they have it all planned, and they bring, like they're somehow Dexter or something like that. And that's not what you typically see. Instead, you see people who are violent in many aspects of their lives, not just this. So the first thing I would say is that they don't just commit sexual violence. They're often violent in multiple ways. They don't necessarily just stick to an offending pattern or an MO or modus operandi. They will vary it in order to commit an act. So instead, they're just a motivated offender. That's the way that the victimology field talks about it. You have to have a motivated offender, someone who's willing to do this, and then they seek out opportunities, whether it's in the moment or whether it's planned out. Most of the time, it's fairly in the moment, but they're not just committing these, they're committing other acts. But our data on looking with the addition of DNA through rape kits shows that actually 40% of our sample were either tied to multiple rape kits and or had another rape in their criminal history, which is much higher than the official recidivism rate, which is 5%. So the official rates you'll see are 5% recidivism rate over about a 9-year span of time, 5 to 9 years. Instead, the number is more like 40 in our data. So it's not rare. And instead they will also, they exploit vulnerabilities, which also means sometimes they will cross over gender. So they rape men and they will rape boys, they'll rape girls, they'll rape women, they'll rape strangers, they'll rape their neighbor, they'll rape their girlfriend. Instead, they're just the rapist who exploit vulnerabilities, not just someone who goes and seeks out this sort of Dexter type of rape that we traditionally think of it in terms of that way. Does that make sense? I can't see your faces. Okay, teacher. So okay. Okay, yeah. Okay, I answered that. Okay. That's a great question. Okay, good, some nods. Okay. For journalists covering LGBT, there is some literature on, there's good research showing that LGBTQ population have increased rates of sexual violence. And I think journalists have to be very mindful of incorporating the LGBT identity without further stigmatizing that community. So, for example, rape is extremely common within the gay community. Okay, it's more common than, for example, in the lesbian community, primarily because your men are more likely to rape. So, in talking about it from the LGBT community, you have to talk about sort of repeated victimization or poly-victimization throughout the lifetime, which is part of the LGBTQ population as well. They're more likely to experience perpetration across the lifespan, but also not stigmatizing necessarily that, but or outing that dynamic. We know that individuals, for example, police who respond to calls of rape and or domestic violence within the LGBT community can sometimes be dismissive of that, of just like, oh, these are just, sort of dismissive of like, these are old just men who got too violent with each other or other sorts of things. So they don't necessarily take the situation as seriously. So helping understand risk and higher risk and dynamics of risk, I think, are really important when looking at sexual violence within the LGBTQ community, but still talking about it from the exploited vulnerabilities, which would still be applicable within the LGBTQ community. And sort of talking about, for example, why transgender individuals, for example, have much higher rates of sexual victimization and other types of victimization as well, but in this context, sexual, because they're transgender, and sort of breaking out why, for example, researchers talk about that, or what the literature says about why perpetration is and victimization occur in higher rates, for example, within certain communities. Does that answer your question? If not, yes, please. And I will say, I have a colleague who specializes in sexual victimization within the LGBT community. So I'm happy to also connect you to individuals and researchers who would be experts in talking about this within, sort of certain populations or certain communities. I would also say that reporting rates for LGBTQ population is very low. So again, in reported information, we almost have no information about the LGBTQ population specifically to that, because there isn't a category for that in the police reports, and certainly not for non-binary or transgender individuals. Yeah, okay.
Great.
Other questions?
Awesome. Well, I think that's our time. Thank you so much, Rachel. This was really great and really informative. There are some additional resources there in the chat too from Jen. And then you all got Rachel's contact information. So that's awesome. Thank you again. If we can give a little round of applause.